In a previously posted video, I began a conversation about the emergence of progressive rock, stressing that its genesis was not a sudden event, but rather the culmination of an evolution. Progressive rock, in its essence, was the consequence and fruition of multiple factors that had been fermenting in the rock and roll crucible, especially from the mid-1960s onwards. The period between 1965 and 1969 is, in fact, an epicenter of transformation, a crucial temporal portal for understanding this stylistic shift, which was indelibly marked by the advent of psychedelic rock. In that initial analysis, I sought to illuminate the close and symbiotic relationship that progressive rock maintained with its roots, which were deeply planted in the fertile soil of the psychedelic moment. Psychedelia was not merely a musical subgenre, it was a comprehensive cultural movement that, in the middle third of the 60s, permeated the arts in general, inevitably spilling over into the world of rock. Thus, it is imperative to recognize that progressive rock is a direct heir, indebted to that wave of sonic experimentation and consciousness expansion that swept not only the United States, but also a large part of Europe. The very term progressive encapsulated a declaration of intent, a conscious break with the constraints of the 3-minute pop song. To progress meant to advance beyond the verse-chorus-verse structure, the themes of adolescent love, and the basic guitar-bass-drums instrumentation. This ambition was a reflection of a particular zeitgeist, the post-war optimism that culminated in the student movements and counterculture of the late 60s. There was a widespread belief that barriers, social, political, and artistic, could and should be torn down. This philosophy found fertile ground in a generation of musicians who, in many cases, had more formal musical training, or at the very least, an intellectual curiosity that led them to explore classical music, jazz, folk, and world music. Alongside this intellectual ambition, technological advances in recording studios were a fundamental catalyst. Multi-track recording technology, evolving from 4 to 8, 16, and then 24 tracks, transformed the studio from a place to capture a live performance into an instrument in its own right. It allowed for the layering of sound, the creation of complex textures, and the manipulation of sound in ways previously impossible. Instruments like the Moog synthesizer, a monophonic monster of infinite sonic possibilities, and the mellotron, a precursor to the modern sampler that used pre-recorded magnetic tapes to reproduce the sounds of strings, flutes, and choirs, opened up sonic palettes that directly fueled the imagination of these artists. The Hammond organ, already a pillar of rock and R&B, was pushed to new extremes of virtuosity and aggression. Before diving into the titans of the genre, it is crucial to dissect its multiple sources. The influence of classical music is the most frequently cited, and with good reason. Bands like The Nice, led by keyboardist Keith Emerson, pioneered this direct fusion, incorporating pieces by Bach, Tchaikovsky, and Sibelius into their energetic rock arrangements. Their work was a bold demonstration that the harmonic and structural complexity of art music was not incompatible with the visceral energy of rock. Another fundamental current was jazz. In particular, the British jazz and R&B scene of the early 60s was a training ground for many future prog musicians. The emergence of jazz fusion, with Miles Davis's seminal work, Bitches Brew, 1970, demonstrated that jazz improvisation and rock's electric instrumentation could coexist in a powerful symbiosis, a lesson that bands like Soft Machine and King Crimson absorbed deeply. The British folk tradition, with its emphasis on storytelling, melody, and acoustic instruments, was also a vital ingredient, especially for bands like Jethro Tull and Genesis. And as already mentioned, psychedelia was the crucible where all these elements began to merge. Bands like the Moody Blues, with their album Days of Future Past, 1967, a collaboration with an orchestra, created one of the earliest prototypes of the progressive concept album, uniting pop songs with orchestral passages. With this backdrop in mind, I reiterate the consensus that King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King, 1969, was the big bang of progressive rock as a self-aware genre. Its opening track, 21st Century Schizoid Man, was a sonic assault that juxtaposed heavy metal riffs, a distorted saxophone echoing the free jazz of John Coltrane, and a middle section of stunning mathematical precision. The rest of the album explored more serene and pastoral soundscapes, using the mellotron to create majestic and melancholic atmospheres. This album contained, in embryonic form, almost all the elements that would come to define the genre. To understand the golden age of progressive rock, roughly 1970 to 1975, it is essential to analyze the unique contributions of its pantheon. The list I propose, composed of 8 seminal bands, serves as a guide to the main stylistic currents. They are King Crimson, Yes Genesis, Pink Floyd, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Jethro Tull, Gentle Giant, and Van der Graaf Generator. King Crimson, under the autocratic direction of guitarist Robert Fripp, remained the most intellectually rigorous and consistently avant-garde force. Its career is a series of dissolutions and reincarnations, each exploring new frontiers. The lineup that recorded Lark's Tongues in Aspic, 1973, and Red, 1974, for example, delved into dissonant and free-form improvisation, influenced by free jazz and 20th-century classical music, creating a music of almost terrifying intensity and precision. Fripp, with his unique guitar technique and his exploration of textures, known as Frippertronics, was an unparalleled sonic innovator. Yes represented the opposite pole, symphonic, optimistic, and spiritually uplifting. Their music was a celebration of virtuosity, with each member operating at the peak of their technical abilities. Chris Squire's Rickenbacker bass functioned as a second lead guitar. Rick Wakeman's keyboard landscapes were entire orchestras. Steve Howe's guitar fluidly transitioned between rock, classical, country, and flamenco. The drumming of Bill Bruford, and later Alan White, was of a stunning polyrhythmic complexity. Above it all, John Anderson's counter-tenor voice intoned esoteric lyrics about cosmic unity and the spiritual quest. The album Close to the Edge, 1972, with its 18-minute title track structured like a symphony, is often considered the pinnacle of this approach. Genesis, during the Peter Gabriel era, offered a more theatrical, literary, and narrative progressive rock. Gabriel was not just a vocalist. He was a performer, using elaborate costumes and staging to bring the stories told in his songs to life. Their music was less focused on individual virtuosity and more on creating atmospheres and developing complex narratives, ranging from mythology, Firth of Fifth, to dystopian science fiction, Watcher of the Skies, and British social satire. The double album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, 1974, was their magnum opus, a surrealist rock opera about the journey of a young Puerto Rican through a bizarre New York underworld. Pink Floyd, though often placed in a category of their own, shares the essential traits of progressive rock. Their genius lay less in technical prowess and more in their mastery of texture, atmosphere, and concept. After the departure of their psychedelic leader Syd Barrett, the band, under the conceptual leadership of Roger Waters and with the elegiac guitar work of David Gilmour, became architects of immersive soundscapes. Albums like The Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, Wish You Were Here, 1975, and Animals, 1977, are cohesive philosophical explorations of themes like madness, mortality, absence, and a critique of capitalism. They were pioneers in the use of sound effects, tape loops, and the synthesizer to create listening experiences that transcended music, becoming cinema for the ears. Emerson, Lake and Palmer, ELP, took the classical rock fusion to its most logical and bombastic conclusion. They were a supergroup of virtuosos. Keith Emerson's showmanship, famously attacking his Hammond organs with knives and commanding a gigantic Moog modular synthesizer, was legendary. Their music was a display of power and grandeur, adapting pieces by Mussorgsky, Bartók, and Ginastera with an arena rock energy. Albums like Tarkus, a conceptual epic about a biomechanical monster, personified both the technical brilliance and the excess that would later draw the scorn of critics. Jethro Tull, led by flutist, guitarist, and songwriter Ian Anderson, carved out a unique niche. Their music was an idiosyncratic amalgam of hard rock, medieval British folk, and classical influences. Anderson's flute, played with a percussive technique and a rock ferocity, was their signature sound. Their lyrics, often sharp and satirical, addressed religion, aqualung, suburban life, and social critique. With Thick as a Brick, 1972, they created the ultimate parody of the progressive concept album. A single 43-minute song, presented as the musical setting of an epic poem written by a fictional child prodigy, complete with a satirical newspaper as its cover. Gentle Giant was the musician's band, the ultimate exponent of academic complexity. Composed of classically trained multi-instrumentalists, their music was a labyrinth of counterpoint, polyrhythm, and intricate vocal harmonies that drew inspiration from medieval and Baroque music. Their songs changed time signatures and keys with a bewildering frequency, creating a sound that was both challenging and incredibly rewarding for the attentive listener. Albums like Octopus and Freehand are demonstrations of a musicianship that few have been able to match. Finally, Van der Graaf Generator inhabited the darkest and most existential corner of the progressive spectrum. A world away from the cosmic optimism of Yes, their music was dense, claustrophobic, and emotionally raw. Driven by Hugh Banton's distorted keyboards, David Jackson's wild saxophone, and above all, Peter Hamill's operatic voice and feverish lyrics about mortality, alienation, and despair, their music was a visceral experience. Albums like Pawn Hearts, 1971, are the sound of a nervous breakdown, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Although the United Kingdom was the epicenter, the phenomenon had global replications. In Italy, a vibrant scene known as Rock Progressivo Italiano, RPI, flourished, with bands like Premiata Forneria Marconi, PFM, and Banco del Mutuo Soccorso, combining British complexity with a distinctly Mediterranean melodic and operatic sensibility. In Germany, the movement known as Krautrock, Kahn Faust Amandul II, Tangerine Dream, followed a more experimental path, less symphonic and more focused on improvisation, hypnotic repetition, the motoric beat, and the exploration of electronics. In France, Magma, led by drummer Christian Vander, invented its own subgenre, Zool, a fusion of Stravinsky, free jazz, and rock sung in a constructed language, Kobayan, creating a music of tribal and apocalyptic intensity. A particularly distinct scene was the Canterbury scene in England, which included bands like Soft Machine, Caravan, and Hatfield in the north. Their sound was characterized by a strong jazz influence, complex harmonies, improvisation, and a surreal, whimsical sense of humor that set it apart from the epic seriousness of many of its peers. In the United States and Canada, bands like Kansas, Styx, and most prominently Rush took the progressive model and merged it with arena hard rock, achieving massive commercial success with albums that retained instrumental complexity and conceptual lyrics. The progressive aesthetic was not limited to the music. Album cover art became an integral part of the experience. The work of artist Roger Dean for Yes and Asia, with its fantastical landscapes, floating worlds, and exotic fauna, defined the visual iconography of symphonic prog. The design studio Hypnosis, on the other hand, created surreal and conceptually dense images for Pink Floyd, Genesis, and Led Zeppelin, using photography and image manipulation rather than illustration. The packaging itself, the gatefold sleeve, provided a larger canvas for the art and lyrics, reinforcing the idea of the album as a total art object. However, around 1975, the tide began to turn. Internally, some bands collapsed under the weight of their own ambition. Albums like Yes's Tales from Topographic Oceans, a double album based on a footnote in a book about Hindu philosophy, were seen by many, including some band members, as the height of self-indulgence. Externally, the socio-economic climate had changed. The 1973 oil crisis and the subsequent economic recession led to unemployment and disillusionment, especially among the British working-class youth. The grandeur and escapism of progressive rock seemed increasingly irrelevant and even insulting. It was into this vacuum that punk rock exploded in 1976-77. Punk was the antithesis of prog. It was raw, direct, angry, and accessible. It celebrated energy over technique, the three-chord song over the 20-minute symphony. Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols famously wore a Pink Floyd t-shirt with the words, "I hate," scrawled across it, a potent symbol of a generation's rejection. Progressive rock was branded as the sound of the establishment, of rock dinosaurs, and was swept from the mainstream by the aggressive simplicity of punk and the pop intelligence of new wave. But progressive rock did not die. It retreated into the underground, becoming a cult genre with a fiercely loyal fan base. Its influence, however, continued to bubble beneath the surface. In the 1980s, a neo-progressive movement, led by bands like Marillion, especially in their early phase with vocalist Fish, IQ, and Pendragon, revived the sound of 70s prog, but with a more polished production and a more emotional, new wave-influenced sensibility. The true revival would come in the 90s, with the rise of progressive metal. Bands like Dream Theater, Fates Warning, and Queensryche fused the rhythmic and structural complexity of Yes and Rush with the power and aggression of heavy metal bands like Iron Maiden and Metallica. This fusion created one of the most enduring and technically demanding metal subgenres. Today, progressive rock is a vibrant and diverse ecosystem. Artists like Steven Wilson, both solo and with his band Porcupine Tree, Opeth, who transition between death metal and pastoral progressive folk, the Mars Volta, with their chaotic fusion of prog, punk, and Latin music, and countless others continue to push the genre into new territories. Specialized festivals and online communities keep the flame alive, connecting a global network of enthusiasts. In retrospect, the project of transforming rock into a serious and perennial art form was a resounding success. Although the genre remains misunderstood by many, who reduce it to a caricature of endless solos and lyrics about gnomes, its legacy is undeniable. Its ambition cleared a path for artists of all genres, from indie rock, like Radiohead, whose album OK Computer is often dubbed the dark side of the moon of the 90s, to post-rock, to think beyond the pop song. The heritage of progressive rock is proof that popular music can be complex, intellectually challenging, and emotionally profound. It represents one of the boldest peaks of creativity in the history of 20th century music, a lasting monument to the power of imagination and the refusal to accept boundaries.